Welcome back to the Black Pill. Today we're talking about sex in our little mini series about sex, gender, and sexuality. So remember two key concepts. The first is reification. Reification is when you treat an abstraction or a concept or a construct as though it were a real thing in the universe with definite properties. And then the second concept is that transition from one thing to two things that occupy two poles to the space between filling up, becoming a continuum, and then becoming a spectrum as it interacts with other important continua. Sex. We used to think that sex was bipolar. There are men and there are women. I mean, strictly speaking, there were men, and then women were a deviant or dysfunctional version of men, not to be afforded any rights or any real respect. That obviously is in the process of changing. And now you would have men and women, but you could also have some category in between men and women. In the old language, that was hermaphrodites. Hermaphrodites either started as a slur or quickly turned into a slur as science words to describe apparent abnormality. Generally just do. So we wouldn't say hermaphrodite anymore. The new word is intersexed. And if we're talking hermaphrodites, usually we mean someone with primary sex characteristics of both male and female. That would be very out of vogue. It's possible. It is possible, but it's exceptionally uncommon. Intersexed is more liberal. Someone who has the primary characteristics of one sex and secondary characteristics of another could be intersex. Someone with a micro penis could be considered intersex. Someone with a very large clitoris that has some of the functionality of a penis could be considered intersexed. So there are lots and lots of ways of being intersexed, and it just increasingly in modernity, it doesn't make sense to think only of male versus female characteristics. It makes more sense to think of this as something of a continuum from maleness to femaleness in the biology. And the biology is complicated. I'm not a biologist. I'm going to do the best I can with some of this stuff. Some number of live births in America are intersexed in some way. And intersexed is a term doing a lot of heavy lifting. I've seen the number bandied about. As many as 4% of live births are intersexed, but you're counting a lot of phenomena, a lot of biology that we wouldn't all agree necessarily constitutes being intersexed. The number is probably lower, but it does give you that spread. Again, anything from a male experiencing gynomastia, the development of female breast tissue, to someone with a testicle and an ovary. Prior to the last 20 years, a baby born intersexed would just be assigned a sex by the doctors. And in that sex assignment, there probably would be some surgery and possibly some hormones involved. A boy born with a micropenis would possibly have a castration procedure because a boy with a micropenis couldn't possibly have a satisfying sex life as an adult male. And by the late 60s and early 70s, when we had the technology to do a penile inversion, create a vagina, we have the hormones necessary to produce an apparent female puberty. It seemed like a good idea at the time, I guess. And it's wrong. I'm not much of a moralist. I don't necessarily mean morally wrong, although that's a difficult conclusion to escape. I mean, it's incorrect. I'm thinking of a story of a I'm thinking of a boy who lost his penis in a circumcision accident. They burned part of it off, and they treated it like a micro penis. They're like, well, with only a stub, he can't possibly. And there was an evil psychologist involved, and so forth. And I'll try and remember to link a BBC story for you, sort of in the down belows there. Okay, so sex isn't as bipolar as we thought it was. And obviously, I don't mean bipolar in terms of a psychological category. Bipolar is in having two poles, which is what the bipolar category means in psychology. Yeah, it's already more of a continuum, and we haven't thought about it very hard yet. So there are folks who we call the Guevadochis largely in the Dominican Republic. It's a place where there's been a certain amount of genetic drift because of isolation over the last couple hundred or so years. It can happen elsewhere, but it's very rare. The Guevadochis would experience testosterone resistance. Uh, Before puberty, there's a certain amount of testosterone in a boy's system, slightly in excess of that in a girl's system, but it's very minor. It hardly counts for anything. And so that amount of testosterone, the person is resistant to, and so they don't develop their primary sex characteristics like other boys do. If you did an internal examination for some reason, you'd find nested up in the vagina functional penis and testicles, but no one ever goes looking. That would be weird. And then on or about the child's 13th birthday, puberty is hitting, and there's a testosterone surge. There's so much testosterone that it does affect the system. And then basically the primary sex characteristics develop very rapidly. And almost overnight, your little girl grows up to be a man. And it's uncommon. And folks in DR, especially in rural DR where this is likely to happen, they would have some fairly traditional sex and gender norms. So it wouldn't be just like, this is another thing that's happening. They would think it was strange. They would have a problem accommodating to it, but it happens just enough that they know what to do. And so that little boy now, that young man now, gets sent to a new school, and at the new school is introduced as his own cousin to explain any similarities and why he'd be living with this family that has never had a son before. And he just starts dressing in men's clothes and doing men's things, and that's that. And I guess we never talk about it again. So that's testosterone resistance. But you can also have outright testosterone immunity, that the body just is not making the right shape of receptor site for testosterone. No amount of testosterone can have any effect on that child's development. And so she grows up completely female. She has testicles where her ovaries should be, where you'd expect to find ovaries in someone with this body type. But they make testosterone rather than estrogen in large amounts. But she has a fully female puberty except for menstruation. She never menstruates, is infertile, and that'd really be how this might be discovered. Is if she's really interested in fertility and she's going to a doctor and getting scans and so forth, the doctor finds testicles where they expect to find ovaries, and that's a potentially unsettling revelation. But she's as feminine as you can get because there's nothing to masculinize her. Testosterone, there's plenty of it in the system. It has nowhere to land. So that would be testosterone immunity. So genitalia are just not fully reliable indicators of sex. They're fairly reliable. Like, we evolved here, and all of your ancestors who did not have sex are not your ancestors, okay? It's important to humans that we be able to detect the so-called opposite sex so that we know with whom we are likely to have success in breeding. And if boys try to breed with boys, that's wasted effort. And if girls try to breed with girls, that's wasted effort. And I'm not making any kind of argument that we should do it that way or we should punish people who want to have fun in bed with people of their same sex. Um, After all, there's almost 8 billion people on Earth. And if you want to fix climate change, you'd have to bring that number down. Like human population is the number one foregoing cause of of climate change. So everything like breeding is not moral. It's morally neutral. It is not good or bad necessarily to breed. Uh, but the breeding prerogative is built into us. Uh, yeah, there's more of an argument to be had here, and we'll get to that we'll get to that in sexuality. All right, but genitalia are not completely reliable markers of sex because somebody could have a vagina and an XY chromosome. You could have a vagina and testicles where ovaries might be expected with that body type. Deeper than that, certainly. I am not an expert in matters trans, and when we get to trans, we'll have a longer discussion of that too. Okay, do. So, what about chromosomes? What about chromosomes? Humans, mammals famously have an XY shape at chromosome 23. Now, the X shape is a consequence of taking a long, thin piece of string and twisting it. Twisting, until it can't take any more twist, but then continuing. And so it wraps around itself in what's called a supercoil. Then, when you've coiled it to the maximum, you keep coiling it, twisting it, and it coils around itself more. And eventually, what you end up with is this classical X shape. Now, the Y chromosome is shrinking over time so that it's ditching all of the genetic information that's not strictly relevant to making penises and testosterone and so forth, um, which means it's not long enough to form that last tail that would make it an X, and so it's a Y shaped chromosome. And that's how mammals, that's how humans create sex. If you have the double X at position 23, then you are biologically female. I hope you can hear sort of the air quotes around those words. And then if you have the XY, you're biologically male. Meaning what? Because those aren't completely reliable. It's not a totally reliable system. There can be transcription errors, differences. It's hard to avoid ableist language when you're talking about these things. Sometimes a girl has only an X chromosome in position 23 and no second chromosome at all, neither an X nor a Y, nor any other sort of shape you could imagine. It's just an X0. And that condition is called eponymously Turner syndrome. That girl's going to grow up somewhat short statured. She might have some frontal lobe impairments, probably a cardiac condition that we need to catch in childhood. She's not making estrogen or testosterone in large quantities or growth hormone. And so those things have to be supplied. She has the privilege, I guess, of sort of picking how tall she wants to be in adulthood. And we would give her growth hormones until she reaches that tallness. And then if she wants an outward puberty, estrogen to create breasts and fat on the hips and all of that. And that's called Turner syndrome. Most Turner's girls until about 20-25 years ago would have died in childhood. And now we can catch that heart defect early and keep folks sort of stringing along. Um, you could have multiple copies of X chromosomes. You could have multiple copies of Y chromosomes. 3X's, 4X's. So I've never met someone with more than four, but I understand they exist. 2, 3 Ys. Um, and those would be difficult lives in many ways. It would be difficult to survive with those chromosomal abnormalities. Puberty would be difficult or complicated. I mean, whose isn't? No, I mean medically difficult and medically complicated. Probably some behavioral problems, frontal lobe inhibitions. Again, um, that's just people. Bugs, I understand, like about a third of the insect world doesn't have a Y chromosome. They have an XZ chromosome. What does that mean for humans? Probably almost nothing. Amphibians don't have chromosomal sex at all. Temperature, the temperature at which the eggs are incubated creates the maleness or femaleness of those embryos. Reptiles too. So you've seen Jurassic Park, and in Jurassic Park, all of the dinosaurs are female because um, they incubate them at the female inducing temperature, and any males that would accidentally spawn because of errors, they would just kill. Well, this was a conservation crisis with sea turtles, where the scientists at the time didn't understand that incubating eggs at a particular temperature would make males. And if I remember correctly, I have no idea which it is. I'm not a biologist, whether it's too warm or too cold, but it was one or the other, and they made all male sea turtles, and male sea turtles can't lay eggs. They could only fertilize them. Females are far more valuable in conservation than females. And so it was like years before they discovered this error and corrected it. And it was a great big setback. Some amphibians can spontaneously change their sex. Go back to your Jurassic Park again. In the movie, they fictionally spliced the missing parts of dinosaur DNA with frog DNA, right? And so some of the dinosaurs spontaneously switched to male. And this is a thing that happens in nature. If there are not enough males to get the job done in a pond full of female frogs, one or two of those females will sort of bite the bullet and take one for the team and just switch to male. You know, grow a penis and testes and swim around fertilizing eggs for the good of the collective. You know, take the hit. Some kinds of fish have different kinds of maleness. There's a territory taking dominant guardfish male, and then there's some smaller males who sort of swim around that territory and look like females and breed with the females, and they add something to the collective about keeping it clean or something like that. And then there's females, and if something happens to the big male, then one of the small males spontaneously develops the big male characteristics and takes over that role. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that the natural world is no kind of guide to morality. The natural world is amoral. It's neither moral nor immoral. If we're going to base human morality on animals, I guess we have to consider the praying mantis. Um, Laying eggs takes a lot of metabolic energy. And so the male mantis presents himself to the female as a gift. If she accepts the gift, she bites his head off. And the parts of the mantis that do sex are not in his brain, they're in his neck. So when she bites his head off, he can still complete the act of sex while she is consuming his body. And that sacrifice allows her to have enough calories to survive laying those eggs appropriately. Fellas, gentlemen, ready to step up here? If that's what's moral, if what's in the animal world is what's moral, you have to consider the mantis and the black widow spider and all those other examples of stuff that humans would not consider morality. This is a con game. This is a con game. Sort of the Christian right liked to say that anything except cis heterosexuality Anything except sex for the purpose of making babies and populating God's world was immoral and unnatural. That God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, that old tired thing. And so, sort of the civil rights communities looked for examples of same sex behavior in the natural world and found it. There's gay lions at the San Diego Zoo. Is it San Diego? There's that pair of storks in Northern Europe that have pair bonded for life, and they're both males, and gay penguins and gorillas giving each other oral sex. And wherever you look, if you look long enough in the natural world, you're going to find same-sex stuff happening, and therefore it's natural. But that doesn't mean it's right. And it also doesn't mean it's wrong. And it never did. This is a shell game. It's a shell game. It's people indulging in a stupid argument that we shouldn't ever have indulged. It does reveal a certain amount of hypocrisy. If you say a thing is wrong because it's unnatural, and I can demonstrate that it's natural, and then you still don't change your mind, you're revealing that your problem is not the unnaturality of the act. Your problem is something else. What is that something else? But there's a more central question that I think we should ask more directly, and that is, does the government have the right to regulate adult consensual sexual activity? Either they do or they don't. Because if they have that right for same-sex interactions, any kind of non-procreative interaction, then they have the right for all other interactions. If the government can go in same-sex couples' bedrooms, they can go in your bedroom too. There it is. Do they have that right, or do they not have that right? And if so, who do you want to have that right? Because your party won't always be in charge of the government. So all these arguments about nature, they're really a shell game, they're a distraction, they're euphemistic speech. The differences between male and female humans are, in fact, quite small. When we look at men and women, the 100-meter sprint at the Olympics, year after year, I went back and reviewed all of the times for the 100 meters over the last 50 or so years, and the difference between the male gold medalist and the female gold medalist is always about 1 second. It's about 1 second. Which, in a 100-meter thing, when it comes down to often tenths or even hundreds of seconds, is significant. But as a population, almost any of the women at the Olympics running the 100 meters, even the ones who don't qualify for the final, could outrace almost any man on Earth. These are small average differences. The shapes of our bodies. How large is our chest? Where do we store body fat? Gentlemen tend to store it in the front, and ladies tend to store it in the back and sides, and what kind of genitalia we have. Penises are almost the same as vaginas. That doesn't seem obvious to you, but ask anyone who's done that surgery. They're so similar you can make one out of the other. It's complicated, sure, but not impossibly complicated. Our abilities on things like math. The differences on math tests have evaporated over the last 40 years, so that even by the 2000s, only the mathematicians who provoked the interest of the CIA would be more heavily male. And now there's no difference at all, because our education is better. That was a mark of American sexism in our neuroanatomy. So we have these small average differences: height, stature, body fat percentage, relative strength. And if you're walking around on the street, you're going, that black pill dude is insane. Look, it's very clear that those are dudes and those are chicks. Yeah. Yeah. Those small average differences seem very obvious to you because they are very useful to the species. They might not be very useful to you as an individual, but as a species, the more we can tell who has a penis and who has a vagina, the more we can successfully breed. Is that moral? It's nothing to do with morality. Leave it alone. All right, so that's sex. Let's let it go there, and I'll come back at you with gender here in the next episode.